Presented by the Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm your host, Dexter Wimberly, and I'm elated to introduce you to today's guest. Samuel Levi Jones was born and raised in Marion, Indiana. Trained as a photographer and multi-disciplinary artist, he earned a BA in Communication Studies from Taylor University and a BFA from Huron School of Art and Design in 2009. He received his MFA in Studio Art from Mills College in 2012. Jones' work is informed by historical source material and early modes of representation in documentary practice. By deconstructing historical materials and reimagining them as new works, he explores the framing of power structures and the struggle between exclusion and equality. More broadly, his practice investigates manipulation and rejection of control. Jones is the recipient of a 2014 Joyce Alexander Wine Artist Prize awarded by the Studio Museum in Harlem. His work is held in prominent private and public collections, including SF MoMA, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Rubel Museum, as well as LACMA, Studio Museum of Harlem, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Samuel Levi Jones to today's conversation.
Hello. I'm doing great, thank you.
Good.
It's going well.
So, where are you tuning in from today?
I'm in Los Angeles from Villemeuter Gallery.
Oh, fantastic. Do you have a show that's opening soon? Or I think I saw that I know that you've done quite a bit of work with that gallery.
So yeah, there was a delay there, but I got the question, and I will be having work in a upcoming group show that opens on the 25th.
Fantastic. So I wanted to kind of go back as far as possible, given the time constraints we have today. So you grew up in Marion, Indiana, and that's not a place I've ever visited. So I'd love to just kind of hear what it's like growing up there, and just sort of like weave that into your sort of origins as an artist.
Yeah, it's a small town about an hour north of Indianapolis, and not a very large town, probably 25,000 population roughly. And if you were to look up the town, one of the first things that you would come across is an image of a notorious lynching that happened in 1930, which I have a close relationship to. So sort of that in relationship to my work, I deal with materials associated with power structures. I work a lot with law books and think about my connection to that and the history of this country, sort of the lack of accountability that's held for folks, and how law really works and serves a particular demographic of people.
So I also came across information about the lynching that you mentioned. And while our conversation is going to be about a heck of a lot more than that particular incident, for those who are watching this now or in the future, can you talk a little bit about like what you recall? Obviously, you were not alive, but can you talk about what you recall about that event, like what you heard about it as a kid or even as a young adult, and how that had an impact on you? And the reason I bring this up is that you know another very well-known lynching or killing in American history, Emmett Till's, is something that had a profound impact on me when I first encountered information about it when I was around 14 years old. I think it changed my life in many ways. And so I just wanted to hear from your perspective how that event affected you.
I didn't learn about the lynching until I was a sophomore in high school, and I learned about it from a history teacher. And that particular teacher spoke of it, showed the photograph, showed it was probably a postcard, because there are postcards that were created and distributed on the 65th anniversary of it. So my sophomore year, I was in 1995, and I went home and asked my father about it, and that's when he had shared with me that one of the two men that was killed was my stepmother's uncle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and my question to him was, why am I learning about this important event from some strange white man in school? And it's not a discussion that's happening here in this household. And he just sort of said, we don't. It just sort of, we don't talk about it, if you will. And it's interesting, sort of growing up in Indiana, and I've heard of Indiana described from someone once. They described it as the most northern southern state. And growing up in school and taking history classes, there was this way in which Indiana was taught to us as any other northern state, that that slavery didn't exist because of moral decisions, and that actually wasn't the case. I learned as an adult that slavery didn't exist in Indiana because there was an effort to keep black people out of Indiana. It wasn't from a moral standpoint.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me. I recall reading Frederick Douglass's biography some years ago, and the biography is so long. Like by the time you're done reading it, you almost have to start over because it's just so much information. But
Yeah.
so much of his life was sort of looking at this contradiction of what America is, what it tells itself, but what it actually does. And I've been having a lot of conversations with people, not just artists, about that recently, given this 250th anniversary of the country. This like moment where, on the one hand, you have some folks who are just celebrating it like it's a Fourth of July on steroids, and then other people realizing just how far we have to go. I was having a conversation. I'm based in Japan. I don't know if you knew that, but I only bring it up because just yesterday I was talking to some folks about the emperor and the imperial family in Japan, and the fact that, without getting into the weeds here, there's a succession issue because it's usually passed on from a male to a male, right? But because of the way the family has kind of like been structured, it's actually there wasn't a male to become the next emperor. It was actually a woman would have inevitably taken that role, but there's been some voting against that happening. And even though this isn't like a political role, it's more symbolic, right? They're not making policy. There's still this sort of like trapped in tradition, right? In a way. But the prime minister of Japan is a woman, right? So the person with the real power actually is the woman, but they don't want someone with just symbolic power to be a woman. And I said, well, you know what? Who am I to judge? America is 250 years old, and we've never had a woman president, right? We had enough stuff to clean up over here, over there, depending on how I look at it. Not to mention never having a Latino president, never having, an Asian president, never, like all of these things. 250 years and still no progress in that regard. And of course, Barack Obama being the only exception. And so that long sort of like winding explanation I just gave, the reason I brought it up is because you mentioned, something earlier on was about like accountability, right? And I think that one of the things that I think about when I hear word accountability in the context of, say, American history is that there are people who just don't want to be held accountable for the difference between the rhetoric and the action, right? And I think your work kind of deals with that a lot. I know that publications and books are a big part of like your practice. Can we talk a little bit about your source materials, things that inspire you? Like where are you looking for inspiration?
Yeah, I've worked with encyclopedias. That was the first source material that I worked with, and that all stemmed from a work that I made, which was a reactionary work to Gerhard Richter's 48 portraits, because those portraits of all white men were sourced from the encyclopedia. And so I began with that, and I started thinking about individuals, particularly black individuals, who could have been represented in that source material who were not. And so I made a set of 48 portraits that consisted of 24 black men and 24 black women who were not imaged in the encyclopedia that year, which was 1972. That was the year that he may have finished that work, if you will, and it was shown in Venice for the first time. And then it just became a continuation of deconstructing the material. And I went from encyclopedias to adding law books. And that was in response to police brutality, because around that time was when smartphones were becoming more and more prevalent. So people had, recording devices. They were recording these instances. And my immediate reaction was to get law books and start addressing the issues of, how those who look a certain way impose violence, but, are not held accountable in the way in which they should be.
You also use flags, if I'm not mistaken, in your work, sort of British and American flags. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that's been a recent addition to my source material. Yeah, deconstructing British and U.S. flags within the work. Yeah.
And what is it about the flag? I mean, I think I could sort of make an assumption, but like how do the flags connect to the publications in your mind?
I mean, the flag itself is just material related to symbols of power. These sort of physical objects that we look at and we hold as important. So if you think about encyclopedias or you think about law itself, it's sort of information that is related to how we exist, sort of how we are controlled, how we navigate systems, how we navigate space, how we navigate each other as people. And the flag, if you will, and it's interesting because when I tell people that I use that material, and they ask me, is that allowed? Are you allowed to do that? But it is this symbol of sort of, this empire, if you will. And thinking about that, and really also thinking about how, it's like I was born and raised here, and I don't sort of use the material as this sort of over-encompassing way of being completely negative, but it's, talking about this way in which, we should have the ability to be critical of the things that we participate in. And, I've used art books as well. I've used art history books as well within my work. And, I'm participating within the arts and I'm participating in the space. And, it's important. I feel like it's important to, just because I'm participating, I shouldn't label it or view it as, or talk about as this perfect system. We should have the ability to be critical as well and talk about the ways in which things can be improved.
What are you feeling about this moment that we're in right now? I mean, I know that's a kind of a big open-ended question because there's so many things that are going on, everything from the administration to ICE, it's the anniversary, the just the general like moment of America right now. How is that finding its way into your work?
I mean, using the U.S. flags, the text that not the text, but rather the titles that I give to my works are quite specific as well. And, for example, and we'll get to these images, but one of the works that I titled is First Amendment. You think about, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom of assembly, and those things aren't being honored for the people. Just recently there was some individuals who, had got prison sentences for protesting. And it's tricky. I've seen situations where, there was an instance where a woman who was working at a polling station, and the FBI showed up and asked her to remove something from her social media account. And what does that mean for me in terms of like using this work, being critical of government and being outspoken about it? I don't know. I think it's a necessary thing. I think it's necessary to push back. And yeah, we're in an interesting moment, and you're sort of stuck at this place where you decide whether you're going to be outspoken or be quiet. But I can't do the latter. It's always my work is really closely related to these things, and it's just a part of who I am, and who I am comes out within the work.
Speaking of the work and the images that we have, why don't we start looking at some of these images and I can have some follow-up questions with you. So what I'd love for you to do is just take a moment, share what you'd like about each work as we go through it, and then I'll follow up with a couple of questions.
Yeah, this work is titled Esse Defectum, and using this title, and I was thinking about the language associated with the history in relationship to this sort of like, I don't know, this elitist mentality in terms of perfection, and of course that means I have the English translation in it, to have been failed. And in this piece, I've used law books and I've deconstructed the U.S. flag. And so the red that you see is from the red stripes of the flag. The white is used from the white stripes, and then the blue is used from the blue area that has the flag, or where the stars exist. And there's one visible star on this work, and yeah, and this work sort of, if you will, is much less abstract than a lot of my work. It's more intentional in terms of like what's visible. And yeah, thinking about coming up on the 250th year of this country, think about that as well, and that significance.
Yeah, and the flag obviously shows up in a lot of artists' work. Artists from different backgrounds, and everyone has their sort of like different relationship with it. Whether you're Jasper Johns or Dred Scott, right? Depends on who you are, I suppose. Um, I'm curious about your sort of relationship with institutions and how showing challenging work, how do you navigate that? I mean, obviously there's some collection exhibitions, like your work is it's currently on view at the Harvey B Center. There's the exhibition Beyond Boundaries, Black Abstraction, and the Elliot and Kimberly Perry art collection. But I know you've showed with quite a lot of institutions over the years, some of which I mentioned in your bio. Without naming names, have there ever been any sort of like challenging scenarios, like with the subject matter of your work?
Um, I can't. I guess I can't get. I'll name a name, and it's not. And I was invited to be in an exhibition at the first university that I attended in Indiana, Taylor University. And that exhibition, I believe, was within the last couple of years. And I was in a group show, and the professor who invited me to participate in that show just sort of wanted to, reintroduce me to the community, if you will, and think about possibly doing a group show. And we had an ongoing conversation for 2 or 3 years before it actually happened. But once I did that that group show, we came back and we had another conversation, and he said, I'm going to hold off. And my response to him, I said, my thinking is that if you want to continue showing me, you're not so concerned about holding your job, maintain your position at the So, but yeah, that me attending that university was a big challenge for me. I played American football there and experienced racism on the field and off the field. And, it was interesting to go back to that space and share the work that I shared. But I think in those situations, if you're coming up against opposition, there's this way in which it feels like you're doing something right.
Exactly. I think that's absolutely true. And the moment that we're in now politically, I think is obviously very difficult for a lot of artists to navigate because of the risks that are involved. Those are, or at least the risks that are more obvious now. The risks are always there, but because of the sort of vocalness, if that's a word, vocalness of the people who want to censor what artists get to say, I think there's definitely a different kind of pressure. But you're right. If everything is going smooth with no resistance, maybe maybe you're not having the right conversation to some extent. I think there might be some truth to that. Let's go to the next image. I'll ask the magicians behind the scenes to advance to the next image. Well, while they're planning to do that, I'll ask you a couple more questions. Maybe there was like a technical issue. So okay, great. Well, let's get into this, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay. So yeah, this was the work that I mentioned a few moments ago. First Amendment, made from law books, and yeah, just sort of in many ways the way in which it's a monochromatic work. A lot of my earlier work was monochromatic, and I've mixed up the colors as you see this work behind me as well. But yeah, just First Amendment and thinking about these challenges that we're going through, the sort of these rights and privileges that we are told that we have, and yet we don't truly have them. And you were sort of in this state now to where it feels like there's an attempt to really, really take those. And it feels like a moment of suspense in terms of, where we may, end up, in the next day or the next week or the next month. And, going back to what you were talking about earlier about how artists are making decisions of taking risk or not taking risk. And yeah, I can say that I'm truly grateful for those who support me, the guys that I've worked with who show my work. And that first work that we showed, the flag piece, that was recently shown at Independent in New York. And I got feedback where someone had said there wasn't very much political work in the fairs. And, I have gratitude to any time and opportunity that someone gives me a space and a platform to, share this work.
That's great. Speaking of abstraction, can we talk a little bit about some of your influences? Who are the artists that you're looked at? Like where do you go to sort of get replenished?
Early on, my introduction to making was photography. So I was looking at a lot of photographers early, particularly Gordon Parks. And the work had changed through grad school, and I gravitated more towards using specific materials, and was introduced to Mark Bradford, and he and I had a lot of conversations about material. So I think about him a lot, and I think about the way in which, the materials that he's using. He calls the works paintings, but they're not paintings, and thinking about sort of the disruption of hierarchy within the medium of art as well, and also that relationship to the hierarchy that we impose on people, and sort of elevating the things at the bottom that aren't held as significant or as important. So that's, he was definitely and is a big influence. But generally speaking, I at the end of the day, my head is just down, and I try to focus on what I'm doing within my work and how it changes and how it evolves. And I try to read as much as I can as well, and that's reading literature of folks who aren't visual artists. But yeah, it's for the most part, I don't really take a whole lot of or pay a whole lot of attention to what other artists are doing. Yeah.
No, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. Well, let's go to the next image. Maybe there's a delay on the images advancing. So while that's happening, we can just kind of continue our discussion.
Okay.
And as soon as
There
I
it
say
is.
that, the next image shows up. So all good, all good. I want to go back to encyclopedias for a moment because I actually like I really loved printed encyclopedias when I was a kid. One of the earliest memories I have, um, just when it comes to like reading on my own outside of school, was visiting my mother's friend. So when you're like 8 years old and your mom goes to see her friends, you kind of just have to go. You don't really have a choice. And one of her friends had the World Book Encyclopedia of like I think it was like 1983 or 84. So this is a long time ago. And I remember, how fascinating it was to go through those books because, again, no internet, no social media. You just kind of like had what you had. Um, but I also, in hindsight, look back to how authoritative all of that seemed. Like it was like not anything that was up for debate. Like if it was in the encyclopedia, it was just kind of like, then it must be true.
Right.
Right? And there was no way to sort of like push back against any of the information that was in those publications. And I think that that's like it makes a lot of sense that you would have gravitated toward encyclopedias as sort of like a source material, right? Because they are yet another reflection of how information slash power is disseminating. Yeah, yeah.
It's also challenging, especially where we are today with the way in which all this information has been digitized. So I also think about movies as well, and I've seen, and maybe I don't know if you've seen, but in some of these streamed films, particularly black film, there's been conversations about how scenes have been cut from these films. So what does it mean to discard, DVDs or discard physical books? And all this information is digitized, and sort of how we access it, where does it come from, where is the information held? So it's a bit of a catch-22. And I feel like at some point, maybe, and I think it was around maybe 2012, 13 that Britannica stopped printing encyclopedias. But maybe there will be a point in time at which we'll want that again, and that'll be revitalized. I don't know. And so
Yeah, I mean,
but think about, but to talk about the information. So there's we had the encyclopedias, and you go look for the encyclopedias, and we see things that, for example, that 1972 set of encyclopedia, I made a piece titled, so I think it was titled 736 Portraits, where I cut out all of the formal pictures of white individuals to juxtapose them with formal individuals of black individuals. And of that 736 roughly, there are only 13 African Americans. So there's that. And then you think about sort of, coming into the digital age, thinking like, okay, there will be an opportunity to have more information, have truer history. And that is there. And it's like we had a beautiful moment of that, but now we're in this scary place of sort of the removal of those things again. And where do we find the balance?
It's difficult to find the balance, and that slippage it was happening slowly for years, and then it just sped up in the past decade in a way that it just really, I think, we lost control. When I say we, I just mean, it seems like in some ways Western civilization is like lost control of its self, and lost control of any grounding in objective truth. And that there is this, now we debate things that are objectively real, but because of the way information is edited and disseminated, people get to pick their own version of reality, right? A
Yeah,
completely
and that
different version of reality.
right. And then we're in this place too where all of that sort of information has been extremely polarized.
Right.
And yeah, and with those polar opposites, yeah, like you said, like it's like it's becoming more and more difficult to find a middle ground.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's take a few moments to talk about the work that's on screen now. And I know we have a few more images after this. I'd love to make sure we have enough time.
Yeah, so this work, Old Glory Disgrace, comes from the flag, termed as Old Glory. And if I remember correctly, the history of it came from, I think there was an individual who had a U.S. flag, and he quilted it into some other flags or some other material, something like that, in order to like preserve it and keep it from being taken. Um, but yeah, this work, the white that you see there is made from pulped U.S. or the pulped white stripes of the flag, and then that solid white line in it with there's a grommet at the top, and that's the edge of the flag to hang it, and then the green side is our law books. But in this work, that green that you see on the right side, it's a completely stitched work that's underneath the pulp as well. So I've been making these works where I do sort of my typical work with the raw material, and then I'll cover parts or sometimes all of the that stitched book cover part. So it's almost like painting over a painting, if you will.
I was just having a memory as you were talking about the old flag and the Old Glory. I was just thinking back to like being in elementary school and doing the Pledge of Allegiance like every day in school. I don't know if kids even do that anymore. I haven't been in an elementary school in the U.S. and I don't even recollectable past. But I just thinking about how my relationship with the flag was so like formed and influenced all through my like youth. Like literally every Thursday we do sing the Star Spangled Banner. Do people even do that anymore? I don't even know in school.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different things happening now. There are different places that are bringing. I don't know. That's maybe but tangent, but not so far off. But bringing the Bible back into schools, and having, I guess, classrooms read verses and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's heavy. It's heavy. Let's go to the next image. So this is quite different. Yes.
Yeah, so in this work here, I've been playing a bit more. We're just sort of going beyond the edge of the canvas, if you will. And of course, you can see the white stripes on the flag where I just removed the white stripes, and there's slivers of the red stripes on the in between. And I sewed the white stripes together, and then the black materials from where I've pulped the book covers of law books. And the color, when I'm talking about pulping the material, the colors that you see are in relationship to the raw material that I'm using. So if I'm using, so on the previous slide, when I said the white came from the white stripes, I put all the white material together and I pulp it. And then, the title of this work, Impure, Guilty, and Amoral, comes from what was associated with the white stripes. And it was, I jotted it down here in my notes. Purity and innocence. So just sort of, so the white stripes stand for purity and innocence, and I took, the antonym of that and thinking about impure, guilty, and amoral.
Some of your work is quite complex, and then other works are quite minimal. Can you talk a little bit about the actual process of making the work, and like what's your thought process, and even sort of like in studio, what is that experience like for you? Are you working on multiple works at the same time? Or is it a theme that you're engaged with, and then you make works within that theme? Can you just talk a little bit about that process?
Early on, I used to work on one work at a time, and in recent years, I've been working on multiple works at a time, and using. So I source the material, I source the books, and they may come from different places. Early on, I was sourcing them from Craigslist. I really don't use Craigslist so much; it's sort of become like a dead source, if you will. Sometimes eBay, but rarely. This week I'm actually going to be picking up 800 plus law books from a law firm in Indianapolis. And
Wow.
so, a lot of these firms are doing away with these physical books, which I think is interesting because, like I said, what happens when that, you know, maybe the web goes down or something like that, or, it becomes corrupted, or, where are the books, so it's tricky. But so, yeah, I remove the pages from the books. I soak the covers in water, and that loosens the adhesive where I can peel the cloth or the paper part of the cover away, and then remove that rigid cardboard that keeps the cover rigid, and let them dry. Then I compose them on the floor, and then pin them together, and I sew them together. But now, that I've been working with the pulp probably in like the last 6 or 7 years. That was interesting, because when I was working with the raw materials, just sort of like piecing these things together, just like as if they were puzzles, and it was quite simple. But when I started breaking the material down into pulp, it's like I'm making my own paint, if you will. And I had to adjust to that. And I've been playing around with different ways of applying the pulp to the surface. And I would either, do these geometric shapes within the work, or, mix it up and make it abstract. And then also going back to monochromatic, or making like solid colors. And then now I'm playing with, I've been piecing individual panels together and thinking about making the works larger. I've also been like taking segments of old works and removing them, and then adding them to a newer work that I'm working on. So I'm playing with mixing it up more as I go on. And in some of these exhibitions that I have coming up, and we'll see sort of more of that. And thinking about Rauschenberg a bit as well. And I don't know. I've been going through a lot in this last year and a half, and sort of like this funky space in my life that I'm hopefully coming out of, and thinking about how I intertwine that within the work as well. And that's thinking a lot about Rauschenberg recently, and those sort of that crazy muddled look of the work, and yeah, bringing all that experience out within the work.
You mentioned sometimes like sort of re-engaging with or repurposing older works. When you say older, are you talking about works made sort of like within the past year or two, or you mean really older, like a decade plus? And the reason I ask this is that a lot of artists, to their credit, they sell everything, and then that's great in the moment, but they don't have older work around to even be able to engage with, because it's made in the studio, it leaves the studio, they never see it again. And I think that's a missed opportunity for artists. I mean, I don't want to answer my own question, but I really love the idea that artists do keep work around, older work around, sort of see their own journey with their own eyes.
Yeah, it's important. It's important to be able to have that work and sit with it. And if you're able to do that, and I've had some old works that have come back to the studio, and you know, there's a conversation that happens in terms of with the present and the past, and thinking about the future. And and it's interesting too, and thinking about works that were made in different studio spaces and reflecting upon that. So yeah, and a lot of it too, in terms of when I'm making the work, I'm in different spaces in terms of thinking about, I don't sketch anything out. It just sort of, I'm making it on the fly, if you will, a lot of times. Sometimes there will be things that I'll go back to that are older, and that I may like or gravitate towards, and work around that. But generally speaking, there isn't sort of a real, how do I say it? I just sort of approach it in a very loose way, and not a sort of a restraint or constrained way. I try to approach it in a loose way, and enjoy the work, if you will.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we have two more images. Let's go to the next.
Yeah, this was, so how I was describing when I will sew a piece and I'll completely cover it. And there's finance. I use finance books with this one, and there's like a burgundy color, and then I covered it complete with the white pulp from the U.S. flag, and it's titled "Fine Line Between Love and Fear." And yeah, it's and this is another point at which I'm thinking about just playing with the material, like how much I show of something, and also uncovering the old material, or painting over a painting, if you will. Thinking about ways in which I can sort of be critical of myself, thinking about how I can sort of expand, how I can grow, and yeah, and I've made large works like this. So this is 30 by 30 inches. There's works that I've made that are 90 by 100 inches, and I've done a sewn work, and then completely cover it with pulp, and maybe just leave some slivers of the underpainting available. And there's that question, some people ask, are you really doing that? And I had one work that I made where the pulp, as it dried, it started cracking, and then you can see the underpainting within it. Yeah.
When you say the person asks, are you really doing that? Can you explain what you mean?
So you see the pulp, right? And
Sure.
I say that and maybe, so that one of the I think it was maybe 2 slides before, where it was the white pulp, and then on the edge there was the green law books. And so when I say underneath, that green materials covers the entire canvas, and then that could be a made up story. Maybe I didn't actually use that much material, and so in that one work I couldn't get away with it. So the truth eventually became visible, if you will.
I get it. I get it. Let's advance to the next image, which I believe is the last one.
Yeah, complex occupation, and this is the work that's in the exhibition. One of my earlier works, and this actually, this title came from an Erykah Badu song, "The Other Side of the Game." You remember that
Yeah,
one?
of course. I just listened to it the other day.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Baduism.
yeah, and in that line, it's um, brother got this complex occupation, and it ain't that he don't have education. And so when I finished grad school, had 3 degrees at that point in time, and there was a couple of years, that I was working for some folks in the cannabis industry, and my thought was, it's like this after 3 degrees, this is where I am. That, and Erica Badu is also a fellow Pisces as well, so there's that relationship. And there's this authenticity within her music that that I can relate to, and how she sort of carried her career.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now that we're talking about a work that's that's in the exhibition at the Gantt Center, I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about it's like some of the collections that your work is in. What does that mean for you as an artist to bring these kind of complex ideas within the institutional framework? So your work kind of critiques the institutional framework in many ways, but also exists within that framework. So I'd love to just kind of hear some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think it's okay for us to participate in something and critique it, and not from a standpoint of, from a place of hate or anger, if you will. But it's like, how can we have these conversations in order to think about, the difficulties in relationship to the lack of inclusion, the lack of diverse representation, opportunity, and that's sort of what it is for me. And I grew up in Indiana. I returned to Indianapolis 9 years ago, roughly. I had an exhibition at Newfields, better known as the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and and I think I'd say that a lot of times, in a lot of places, it's rare for a local institution to give a local artist an opportunity to exhibit. And I felt like after I had that exhibit, there were other instances following that where artists and other art agencies, if you will, in the local community, they were getting more opportunities to exhibit in that museum. And so, I think that it's for me, it's a way to be able to have a conversation. I was on the board of the museum for a few years, and I remember, being in some of those meetings, there were things that I would say that no one else would say, and staff in the meeting they kind of shake their head yes, as like, thank you for addressing that, because they wouldn't dare say those things. But yeah, I think, how do we use these situations as an opportunity to, give voices to those who don't have a voice?
So true, so true. And I think it's important for artists, if they're able to engage with institutions, either on a board level or even just as a consulting level, if we want these institutions to be more reflective of of a world that is fair, a world that is not just inclusive for the sake of checking boxes, but inclusive because everyone has a voice, and everyone who's wants to be a decent person sharing ideas should have an opportunity to do so. If we want to see that happening, then I think we have to be in those rooms, right? And as you say, like, say those things, make those comments that others might be hesitant to make because of fear of retribution, reprisal, or downright losing their job, right? This is like, to be on the outside of the building shouting at it doesn't really change anything. You're gonna have to get inside to make those changes happen, but also to like not lose ourselves in the process of doing that, which is challenging. Also, as success can have a certain kind of effect on people, particularly in the creative fields. We see it in film with filmmakers and authors, etc. You become really successful, and then sometimes you either don't want to piss off the wrong people, you don't want to lose your edge, so you start doing things that are safe, or you start repeating yourself, making work that was like the last successful show. So you're kind of hedging against any sort of like risk. How do you navigate some of those things, like particularly around the idea of like continuously like evolving and moving forward? I mean, as a curator, I challenge myself with that. I know that there are certain subjects that are sort of like easy to get people behind, but there are other subjects I'm interested in that are a bit more challenging, and I keep trying to push myself and push myself. But how do you push yourself as an artist?
I think, the way in which I push myself is, maintaining sort of a staying true to my convictions, if you will. And, um, saying no when I feel like it's necessary to say no without being concerned about, upsetting someone or losing future opportunities. And it's, there's a project that I'm working on, and there's some work that will be shown, and sort of like the running joke for me, if you will, is like maybe the show will be canceled, and what would that mean? Um, but I think, when we think about, and these things do happen, it's interesting because it brings to mind, I think about Amy Sherald's in the exhibition that she had where she canceled the show herself. And, and then the comment that you made is like, when you get to a certain point, do you sort of keep operating in a certain way in which, you are concerned about losing an opportunity? But I love the fact that, she's working at the level that she's working at. And rather than just sort of not rocking the boat, she stayed true to the integrity that she has, and made a very important decision. I think that also allows others to see that, and so she's leading by example, and that creates an opportunity and sort of encourages others to rethink how they navigate these spaces, and gives you encouragement. I think and that's a beautiful thing. I think in that moment too, I was encouraged by that and inspired by that as well. But I think, so we're living this time where, I think there's more sort of freedom to do that. And, um, and you may lose some opportunities, but, you just sort of keep moving. And at some point there will be someone or an institution or collector or curator who's going to support that work. And it may take longer, they may take more time to, get those opportunities, but I think it's well worth the wait. It's well worth sort of the pain. It's well worth, sort of the frustrations that come with that. And but yeah, at the end of the day, when I lay down at night, I want to, sleep well and sleep without regrets.
Yeah, yeah. Do you still do photography? Do you still take photographs? Is that something that you
Not as
gave
much.
up?
Yeah, I haven't done that as much, but it definitely is something that I want to revisit. And I think, now is kind of a time for me to do that. So it'll have to make sense, depending on the subject matter, and for me to pick up a camera and start capturing things.
And what about curatorial work? I know that you curated a show some years ago at Gallery Lelong. I think it was in
Yeah.
2018. Correct. Are there other projects like that you're looking at, possibly, in a curatorial vein?
I would love to do that. That was the first time I had ever curated a show, and that, it didn't come from the desire to want to simply curate a show. It came from, that was around the time of the elections, and, it also, um, the work that was presented by other artists, I asked them to make work in sort of their response to the whole issue around Colin Kaepernick. Um, So that came from an idea in terms of, being responded to some events that were happening, and it started from there rather than, oh, I want to curate a show. So for me, if there's an opportunity to do that again, it'll definitely come from being this point of responding to, some sort of event or events that are going on. But yeah,
Yeah, I love.
I'd love to do that again.
Yeah, I love it when artists curate shows because I think that it's always a interesting experience to see what artists are looking at, like like what from an artist perspective, what are the works that they would select other than their own? Like what are they moved by? Not just the names of the artists they move by, but the specific works. I also encourage artists, if they have the opportunity, to at least curate one show in their career, because I think that it also helps them understand certain things about that process that might not be understood if
Yeah,
you like never
I,
go
I
through it.
I do have to say that I had the luxury of working with Full Along, and of course they did a lot of the heavy lifting, and I was able to in many ways just reach out to artists, ask them to submit work, and it was I was blessed in that sense, and and some of the Melvin Edwards was one of the artists who had work in the show, and he made a work specifically for that show. Melvin played collegiate football, and from what I understand, he could have had a professional career. And the work that he made, there was a football that was one of the elements within the work, and he said it sat around the studio for like 20 years, and that
Wow.
was the opportunity which he just could utilize that piece. So that was a beautiful moment, and it's good to hear those stories. There's a way in which you get to interact with the artists, and Deborah Roberts was in that show, Glenn Kino was in the show, Derek Forjor, um, and who else? So and Derek, when Derek was in the show, of course, we're quite close. And when he came to the open, he kind of laughed at me, and he was like, "You were serious, Sam." He goes, "I wasn't sure how serious this would be," and so that was a compliment. But it was a wonderful experience, and there's a way in which brought me out of the studio and got to engage in a different way. So it was sort of a different exercise. But I think I would definitely love to do that again.
Yeah, yeah, and I also think it's lovely when artists of different generations, like you mentioned Melvin Edwards, like artists of different generations are able to communicate and collaborate around those kinds of projects as well. And I've been making a real effort to, whenever possible, connect with older artists whose work I admire, of course, but I think that there's a tendency for people to sort of work with the people that are at arm's length. Like that just kind of like you kind of fall into this pattern of like, this cohort or coterie of artists that and you're comfortable reaching out to them at the last minute, those kinds of things. Um,
Right.
but I think also part of the growth that I talked about earlier is looking at artists that you don't have a relationship with, who may have been working in the field, perhaps as long as you've been alive, but you want to create an opportunity to bring their work into the conversations that you're having. I mean, I had she isn't as old as I just described, but I had a recent interaction with Carrie Mae Weems, an artist I've admired for so long, and she participated in an exhibition I curated last year, and I was just so honored by it. And I talk about it this way because as far as I've gone in my career, I still and sometimes, and I've been at this a while, but sometimes I feel like I'm at the very beginning. I still like sometimes I still feel like I'm just like starting out, and I know it's not the truth, but it does. Sometimes I feel like that. And so when I reached out to her about the project, and she said yes, I was like giddy, like it was my first show, and it was like so it's like that.
And I guess my question to you is, I have an idea of what you feel in terms of feeling like it's always a first. And so, how would you how could you expound on that feeling of it feeling like a first rather than it feeling like, oh, it's just another show or it's just another project?
Um, you know, I still have so many dreams that have yet to be fulfilled. and I keep my list of dreams very fresh, like things that I want to do that I have yet to do. Like that to me is a list that I hope I never complete. Like I just have to keep, there are artists that I would love to work with that I don't have an established relationship with. There are cities I'd love to do projects in that I've either never visited or never had the opportunity to do a project in. So I keep replenishing that so that I have something to look forward to, something that feels fresh and new. I'll look at a map, and this is a little strange, I suppose, but sometimes I'll just look at a map of the world and I'll say, look at all the places I've never been to. So like all these places I've never visited. As much as I've traveled, there's so many places. So then I just start circling them. Going, I'm gonna do something there. I'm gonna work in this place. I'm gonna meet artists in Oslo. I'm gonna work with artists in Austin, Texas. I'm gonna, and just keep that feeling of beginnings, and not worrying about how. That's the whole thing. You get too caught up in how, you'll just never do anything.
Right, right. It's funny that you mentioned Austin. So is that a place you've not yet worked, or?
I've not yet worked in Austin.
Yeah,
right?
we'll have to continue that conversation.
Yeah, and it's on my list. I'd love to. Well, look, I really enjoyed our conversation today, and and speaking of first, this was our first time to do something like this, and we've never worked together either. So maybe this becomes the beginning for that. So I'll leave it to you if you have any final thing you'd love to share before we conclude today's conversation.
I just, thank you for this moment and this opportunity to have a conversation. And again, it's always, I'm always grateful for an opportunity to be given, a space and a platform to share my work and share these thoughts and ideas, and because they touch a lot of difficult and challenging subject matters. So I'm grateful for that, and just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you. So you have a great evening, Samuel, and we'll definitely be talking soon. The Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt Center to expand its reach and further develop programs like today's Open Air. You can lend your support to the Gantt Center by visiting ganttcenter.org/donate. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel for future programs and other video content updates. I want to thank you all for joining us for today's conversation, and we look forward to next month's Open Air. Good night.